The wilderness is unpredictable. No matter how prepared you are, the native creatures of this habitat may sense your presence, and if they feel threatened, it can quickly turn dangerous. The grizzly bear stands out among these territorial animals, known for defending its domain aggressively when provoked. Sadly for three nature lovers, an encounter with a grizzly turned deadly. With its immense strength unleashed in a fury, none of the hikers survived. Join us as we recount what happened. The summer of 1994 held a specific promise, a sense of wild freedom that Mark, Lisa, and Tom could almost taste as they trudged through a national park in Montana. Each of them had recently graduated from college, eager to mark the end of their academic lives with a grand adventure that would test their limits and bring them closer to nature. The national park offered a backdrop of dense forests, jagged cliffs, and an expansive sky that seemed boundless. The air was thick with pine and moss, intoxicating in its purity. They had heard the park rangers' warnings of grizzly sightings, the tales of protective mothers and potential danger. But the thrill of the unknown pulled them off the beaten path and into the park's deeper, more secluded terrain. By late afternoon, they had set up camp near a berry patch, unaware that the scattered, half-eaten fruit was an unspoken warning. The sweet scent of ripened berries hung heavily in the air, a siren song not just to them, but to the inhabitants of the wild. Their tent sat under the dappled sunlight, casting playful shadows on the forest floor, and the trio busied themselves, oblivious to the silent, unseen presence that lingered close by. Among the towering trees, a mother grizzly watched from a distance, her keen eyes narrowing, her senses attuned to every shift in the surroundings. Her cubs moved nearby, hidden from sight, but never far from her protective vigilance. As dusk descended, the temperature dropped, and an eerie stillness settled over the forest. Mark, Lisa, and Tom sat around a small fire, basking in the warm glow and laughing softly, their voices carrying into the quiet night. But as the darkness grew, the mother bear's instincts flared. The unfamiliar smells, the foreign sounds, and the unwelcome presence spelled a threat to her young. And in the hush of twilight, her slow, deliberate approach began. Her massive body, fur rippling and muscles taut, emerged from the shadows, each step an embodiment of power and purpose. The friends, lost in their celebration, were unaware of the growing danger until it was too late. Suddenly, a flash of brown fur broke the tree line, and the colossal grizzly hurtled toward them, her growls resonating like thunder, cutting through the forest silence with terrifying force. In an instant, primal fear overwhelmed Mark, Lisa, and Tom. They scrambled to their feet, but the bear was already upon them, her movements swift and unrelenting. Mark was the first in her path. A heavy paw struck his chest, sending him sprawling backward, the sheer force of the blow tearing through his clothes and scraping his skin raw. His breath left him in a painful gasp, and as he struggled to rise, the bear pounced. Her jaws clamped around his shoulder, piercing through flesh and bone with a strength that rendered him helpless. Blood soaked his shirt as she shook him, a violent motion that left his vision blurring, his world spiraling. His mind, fragmented and racing, registered nothing but the searing pain and the overwhelming force of the creature pinning him down. Desperate to help her friend, Lisa grabbed a fallen branch and swung it toward the bear. But her act of bravery only redirected the animal's fury. The grizzly released Mark, who crumpled to the ground, his body twitching in shock, his face pale with agony. The bear turned on Lisa with an intensity that froze her in place for a split second, a second too long. Tipped with sharp, curved claws, a broad paw grazed her face, opening painful gashes along her cheek and scalp. She stumbled, hands instinctively rising to cover the wounds as the warmth of blood trickled through her fingers, and she sank to her knees in shock. The bear's roar reverberated through the trees, filling the night with a sound so savage it felt like it came from the depths of the earth itself. She lowered her head, biting into Lisa's arm with unyielding pressure, her powerful jaws breaking bones with an ease that seemed impossible. Lisa's scream cut through the forest, raw and ragged, echoing her fear and the hopelessness of the moment. Her vision darkened, each heartbeat a brutal reminder of the life ebbing from her battered body. Tom, paralyzed by shock at first, finally broke free from the grip of terror that had held him still. He tried to make a run for the tree line, his instincts taking over, but the bear was relentless, sensing his movement and seeing him as the last remaining threat. She surged toward him, her speed unmatched, closing the distance in moments. Tom barely made it a few feet before a crushing weight bore down on him from behind, knocking him to the ground. The bear's claws sank into his back, the points digging deep and pulling with a force that sent waves of agony through his entire body. His chest heaved as he tried to crawl away, but the bear's teeth sank into his lower leg, tearing through muscle and tendon, immobilizing him as his strength waned. Each agonizing minute stretched as fury and survival clashed. Finally, she assured her young were safe, and the bear released Tom and stepped back, her gaze sweeping the scene one last time. Then, satisfied, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving the clearing in silence. The aftermath was chillingly still. Mark lay unconscious, pale, with only the faint rise of his chest indicating life, though it faded within minutes. His shoulder and torso bore the deep, bloody marks of the bear's attack. Lisa curled in on herself, drifted in and out of awareness, her blood-smeared face blank, spirit hollowed by the ordeal, as her breaths grew shallow and finally ceased. Tom, sprawled in a pool of blood, fought to stay conscious, but within 5 minutes, the numbing shock overcame him, and all signs of life faded into silence. News of the attack spread swiftly, sending shockwaves through the community and sparking debate on human encroachment into wildlife territory. Some called for stronger safety measures. Others argued that wilderness, by nature, demanded respect for its boundaries. Mark, Lisa, and Tom became symbols in an ongoing debate, each scarred by a stark reminder of the fragile boundary between human presence and nature's raw power. In early October 2002, a chill settled over the dense forests and rivers of British Columbia, where Michael, Sam, Ethan, and Lucas set out for a weekend retreat. Old friends bound by past adventures chose this remote river spot for its solitude and abundance of fish. Far from the beaten path and alive with the tranquility of untouched nature, the lure of silence and stillness had drawn them here. They spent the first day immersed in the river's rhythm, casting lines over its rippling surface as sunlight glinted on the water. Catch after catch brought shared laughter and quiet camaraderie, the river's murmur mingling with their voices. As dusk fell and the sky turned a bruised purple, they set up camp near the riverbank, ready to rise at dawn to fish again. As the air cooled, the scents of pine, wet earth, and wood smoke filled the crisp night air as they gathered around a small fire. Their tent, bright against the dark forest, felt like a haven. But nearby, a lean, hungry black bear had caught their scent days earlier. With every meal cooked and fish gutted, their presence became a stronger signal, like an invitation into its territory. As their laughter faded, the bear prowled closer, hidden by shadows. Unaware of the danger, the men spoke of storing their fish by the river and ignored the half-eaten snacks left nearby. When the fire died and darkness settled over the campsite, they retreated to the tent, their gear still outside. Lulled to sleep by the night's murmurs, they were unaware of the threat lying in wait. The bear emerged from the trees, drawn by the lingering scent of fish and sweat. Hungry and irritable, it ambled toward their campsite, moving soundlessly through the undergrowth. The men remained asleep, unaware of the approach and the danger. Without warning, the bear lunged forward, its hunger exploding into a frenzy as it tore into the tent. Chaos erupted. Michael was the first to feel the attack, who lay closest to the tent's flimsy walls. A blow of raw force pinned him down, claws tearing through his shoulder and sending blinding pain rippling through his body. He thrashed, trying to free himself, but the bear's strength was overwhelming, pressing into him with a weight he could hardly comprehend. Panic surged through him as he felt his flesh give way, his shoulder and upper arm torn under the relentless assault. Sam, stunned awake, tried to scramble backward, but the confined space left him vulnerable. The bear's claws raked across his side, carving deep wounds along his ribs, and he gasped as hot blood soaked his shirt. The searing pain made him lightheaded, his hands instinctively clutching his side as he struggled to roll away. But the bear's rampage left no room for escape. Ethan, trapped in the far corner, fumbled desperately in the darkness, his mind paralyzed between flight and the horrifying reality of their situation. The bear's immense paw lashed toward him, and he felt its claws slash across his leg, ripping through his muscles with a force that shattered bone. Agony surged through his body, his leg rendered useless, yet he gritted his teeth and tried to drag himself toward the tent's exit. Lucas, whose position allowed him a split-second head start, tore through the torn fabric, stumbling onto the cold ground. But the bear pursued him, clawing at his back with a brutal swipe that sent him sprawling. Pain radiated through his spine and ribs, his muscles spasming as he tried to pull himself away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The four men were scattered in the chaos, each locked in a desperate struggle to survive. Their bodies, pummeled by blows and slashed by claws, were left bleeding and battered. Every attempt to move brought fresh waves of pain, and fear clawed at their minds as they realized the extent of their injuries. Blood pooled on the ground, mingling with the dirt and leaves, and each man faced his agony alone in silence while the bear prowled nearby. Finally, perhaps sated or sensing the movement had ceased, the bear withdrew into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. For a long while, the men lay in stunned silence, the weight of the attack sinking in only as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. The forest, indifferent to their suffering, resumed its morning chorus, and the river flowed on, unmoved by their ordeal. In the aftermath, Michael clutched his torn shoulder, his fingers slick with blood as he tried to stem the bleeding. He could feel the jagged edges of his muscles where the bear's claws had sliced through, his body racked with pain. Sam lay on his back, each shallow breath a struggle as his wounds seeped into the earth. His side felt like fire, every inhalation a sharp reminder of the injuries cutting across his ribs. Ethan, his leg mangled almost beyond recognition, drifted in and out of consciousness, the throbbing pain from his shattered bone clouding his mind. Lucas lay nearby, barely able to move, his back a landscape of agony and swelling bruises, each heartbeat a pulse of searing pain. Hours passed as they lay helpless, immobilized by injuries and shock. When they finally found the strength to crawl together, every movement was a fresh reminder of their wounds, their bodies etched with claw marks and bites. Their minds, too, carried new scars, memories of the bear's massive form, the terror that had overwhelmed them, and the stark reminder of their vulnerability against nature's force. Through sheer will, they managed to limp to the forest's edge, every step a brutal test of endurance. Eventually, rangers found them, the story of their ordeal evident in their battered bodies. They were rushed to the hospital and ultimately survived, but not unscathed. While the physical scars bore witness to the attack, the deeper wounds lay in their minds. Nature had shown its power, leaving them bound by a shared nightmare they would carry forever. The Rockies towered like jagged fortresses against the sky, their slopes clothed in dense pine forests, their peaks dusted with early snow. Jack O'Brien knew every ridge and hollow of these mountains, his decades as a guide lending him an almost mystical familiarity with the terrain. Today, he led a small group of hikers who, though eager and fit, needed to prepare for the actual challenges of the backcountry. They'd come seeking a thrill, the raw beauty of the Rockies, and a break from everyday routines. Jack, ever aware of the hidden dangers of the wild, silently hoped their courage would match their ambitions. The day had been tough, but peaceful as they climbed narrow trails and scrambled over rocky paths. The air was crisp and scented with pine. Jack led with steady caution, pointing out markers and sharing climbing tips. Among the hikers were Sarah, who was adventurous but watchful; Michael, an accountant who utilized his work leave well enough; Grace, a gentle older woman; and Ethan, who masked his anxiety with humor. Each followed Jack's calm pace, quietly confronting their fears about the trail ahead. As they rounded a rocky bend, Jack suddenly signaled for silence. The group froze, breaths heavy in the thin air. At first, there was only the whisper of trees in the mountain breeze. Then, just yards ahead, a massive grizzly appeared. It was a powerful animal, fur thick and matted, eyes sharp and focused, muscles moving with controlled strength. The bear paused, head low, nostrils flaring as it caught the hiker's scent. Jack's heart raced. This year, out of its usual territory, was driven by hunger as winter approached. Its look was desperate. Jack signaled for everyone to back up slowly. He felt a ripple of fear pass through the group, sensing their hesitation as the bear watched them, each of its movements an unspoken warning. The trail was narrow, with a steep drop on one side and a sheer rock wall on the other. There was no accessible retreat. Jack's years of experience told him the bear was unlikely to attack without provocation. But the strained quiet of the forest was a reminder that in the wild, certainty was as elusive as safety. Jack fixed his gaze on the bear in the tense minutes that followed, subtly motioning for the group to shift to the side, hoping the animal might lose interest or find an easier path. But the grizzly, starving and frustrated, held its ground, its breaths heavy with the scent of the humans nearby. The animal shifted its weight forward, nostrils flaring, sizing up the strange gathering before it. Jack could feel the tension in his group mounting, see the fearful glances exchanged as their trust in him began to waver. He willed them to stay calm, to keep their fear in check, but he knew the limits of even the strongest nerves. Then it happened, a slight, unintended misstep. Caught in the bear's gaze, Michael tried to back up and stumbled over a loose rock. The sound broke the fragile standoff. The bear, interpreting the movement as aggression or prey attempting to flee, surged forward, its powerful body crossing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Jack moved instinctively, positioning himself between the bear and the group, his arms raised in a futile attempt to appear larger, a last-ditch effort to dissuade the charge. But the bear was relentless. Its mind made up. Chaos erupted. The hikers scattered, driven by instinct, scrambling for any semblance of safety as the bear reached their line. Jack braced himself as the grizzly's weight hit him, its massive paws sweeping him off balance. He hit the ground hard, feeling a surge of pain as claws raked across his shoulder. Sarah had frozen in shock, but Jack's shout jarred her back to reality, and she scrambled to the side, narrowly avoiding a swipe from the bear's powerful limbs. Nearby, Ethan stumbled, attempting to pull Grace out of harm's way as she struggled to regain her footing. Jack, injured but fueled by adrenaline, pushed himself up, blood staining his jacket as he took in the disarray around him. The bear, disoriented by the fleeing bodies, lunged again, its claws catching Michael's leg as he attempted to scale the rocky outcrop beside them. He cried out, pain searing through him, but sheer willpower drove him forward. Jack could feel his strength waning, his shoulder burning, yet he refused to leave his group vulnerable. Amid the confusion, the faint sound of voices and footsteps approached from down the trail. A nearby rescue team, returning from a routine patrol, had heard the shouts and rushed to the scene. The team, equipped with noise deterrents and bear spray, closed in with practiced precision. They deployed sound makers, loud bursts that startled the bear, giving it pause. The grizzly hesitated, its instincts at odds with its frustration, before finally retreating with a snarl, disappearing into the thick trees. Afterward, the mountains were eerily quiet, the calm forest contrasting sharply with the recent chaos. Jack, clutching his injured shoulder, surveyed his group. Sarah's hands shook as she steadied herself, eyes wide with shock. Michael leaned heavily on Ethan, who was grim but focused, helping his friend sit. Grace knelt beside Jack, pale but resolute as she assessed his injuries. They were bruised, bloodied, and shaken, but alive. The rescue team quickly took over, tending to wounds and coordinating the evacuation with calm assurance. Jack's injuries were severe but not life-threatening. Michael needed stitches, and others bore bruises and scrapes, reminders of the fine line between life and death they had crossed. Supported by the rescuers, each aching step down the trail felt heavy, yet each breath held gratitude and the weight of their shared ordeal. Hours later, the hikers could finally rest at the hospital, their bodies tended, minds reeling from the day's events. Jack looked at the faces that had been strangers, now bound by a grim, undeniable kinship. They had ventured into the wilderness seeking adventure, perhaps a hint of danger, but none had expected a battle for survival. The crisp mountain air smelled of pine and the damp earth beneath their boots as the Johnson family settled into their second night at a national park in Colorado. They'd spent the day exploring trails that wound through towering trees and overlooked sprawling vistas, and now they eagerly anticipated a campfire under the stars. Each member of the family was grateful for this escape from the hum of city life. Paul, the father, who'd been yearning for an adventure outside his office walls. Sarah, his wife, an elementary school teacher who adored nature's beauty, and their two children, 15-year-old Noah and 11-year-old Emma, both eager to stoke the fire and tell stories under the broad sky. As dusk settled, the family divided their tasks. Paul and Noah gathered wood from the nearby forest edge, their flashlights bouncing off the shadows cast by dense undergrowth. Sarah and Emma prepared a small area with stones around a circle of kindling. There was a deep peace in the quiet, only broken by the occasional crackle of a branch underfoot and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the cool breeze. The park's night was alive but subdued, cloaked in a silence that the Johnsons found calming, an escape from the noise of their lives. Yet in the stillness lurked an unseen presence, watching them, hidden among the trees. A mother black bear, protective and wary, lay nearby with her cubs. Perhaps, as the family moved deeper into the forest, the bear detected the scent of the unfamiliar. Maybe it sensed a disturbance in its territory. But for a mother guarding her young, proximity was threat enough. Paul felt a chill that went beyond the cooling evening air and suggested to Noah they turn back. They'd gathered more than enough wood, and a few more minutes meant precious time with their family by the warmth of the fire. Paul paused as they approached the clearing, sensing something was amiss, a faint rustling that wasn't merely the wind. He cast his flashlight toward the noise in the dim light, but saw nothing. The forest fell silent once more, as though waiting. The massive yet agile bear had begun to move toward the camp, each padded step silent but certain. When she emerged from the shadows, her black fur melded with the night, revealing only a faint glimmer of eyes that reflected the fire's glow from a distance. She was close now, and each step was an unspoken warning, a signal missed by the family entirely. The first indication of danger was the shuddering crack of branches under the weight of the charging bear. In an instant, chaos erupted. Sarah turned just in time to see the massive animal barreling toward them. Her instincts screamed, and she gestured frantically for the children to run. Paul and Noah froze, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer shock of the animal's sudden appearance and the looming, inescapable power behind it. The bear, threatened, driven by maternal instinct, saw only intruders between herself and her young. Emma stumbled in her attempt to flee, her small frame engulfed in panic. Sarah darted toward her daughter, her heart thundering, a rush of desperation propelling her. Seizing the moment, Paul grabbed whatever he could, throwing sticks and a backpack, anything to distract the bear and draw it away from the family's retreat. The wild and fierce bear lunged, its primal strength leaving devastation. A scream sliced through the air as Noah tripped over a branch, his ankle twisting painfully. Fear surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, limping through the underbrush, his every step throbbing with pain. Paul took in the scene with gut-wrenching clarity. The relentless bear, his fallen son, and his wife shielding their youngest. The fire cast flickering shadows that seemed to pulse with the urgency of their terror. Time warped in the panic. As the bear swiped and lunged, Paul took a split-second decision to push himself in harm's way, his body a desperate shield. In that terrifying moment, he understood that this creature was not malicious, but a mother defending her young. Still, that understanding held no mercy. This was survival, raw and primal. Sarah, meanwhile, dragged Emma to a cluster of boulders nearby, pressing her daughter close to shield her from the carnage unfolding only feet away. Noah staggered to join them, his leg throbbing, eyes wide with a shock that hadn't yet resolved into fear or sorrow, only raw adrenaline that kept him moving. His mother's arm pulled him close, holding her children with a fierce grip as if her will alone could protect them. As quickly as it began, the attack ended. The bear, satisfied that the threat had been neutralized, retreated into the darkness, her growls fading as she disappeared into the shadows with her cubs. In her wake, she left devastation. The remnants of the fire, the scattered wood, and the aftermath of a harrowing encounter that would forever mark those who survived it. In the silence that followed, Sarah's gaze fell on Paul, and the reality hit hard. The man who had protected them, the anchor of their family, lay lifeless, a lasting testament to his sacrifice. Noah and Emma clung to their mother, their breaths ragged, eyes haunted by the horror they had witnessed. Tears flowed, not from relief, but from the numb grief that filled the space where their father's presence had been moments before. The night dragged on in quiet agony. Exhausted and afraid, Sarah rallied herself and her children. They huddled together, bracing against the cold and the memories that would haunt them. Sarah knew they couldn't stay exposed, especially with Noah's sprained ankle slowing them down. Driven by fierce determination, she led them forward through the dark forest. At dawn, the first rays of sunlight brought a sliver of comfort, lighting their path and softening the night's terror. Soon, they encountered hikers who, shocked by their condition, alerted park authorities. Help arrived, ending their ordeal in the wild, though a new journey lay ahead, a journey to heal from the night that had torn their family apart. In the following days, park rangers explained to Sarah that the bear's attack had naturally responded to perceived danger. This knowledge brought a measure of closure, but did little to ease the loss. Their story became part of the park's lore, a solemn reminder of the fragile line between humanity and nature. The Johnson family's lives were irrevocably changed by that night, with a void that nothing could fill. The cold night air settled heavily over the dense forests of British Columbia, where a logging crew labored past dusk. Aaron, the foreman, was uneasy as he looked over his team. The men were tired, drained from the endless machinery churning, and the relentless, high-pitched whine of chainsaws that echoed through the forest. They had pushed their bodies beyond exhaustion in a desperate race against deadlines, and with nightfall now cloaking the camp, everyone's movements slowed with fatigue. Under normal circumstances, they'd have packed up hours ago, storing their tools, food, and supplies carefully to avoid attracting wildlife. But the urgency of their task had overridden protocol. A haphazard pile of food wrappers and scraps lay next to a portable cooler at the edge of the camp, forgotten as the crew hungrily devoured their quick dinner and returned to work. They were unaware their actions had drawn attention from the forest's shadows. They could not know that a large female grizzly was watching, her nose twitching as she caught the scent of meat and sugar drifting through the fantastic night. This grizzly had recently lost her mate, and food was becoming scarce with the turn of the season. Instinct drove her down from the mountains to scavenge, her hunger pushing her closer to human activity than usual. She prowled just beyond the tree line, her gaze locked on the men as they milled about camp. Her ears caught every sound, her powerful body tense and ready. At first, she stayed back, wary of the unfamiliar machinery and lights, but the scent kept calling, driving her closer. The foreman and his crew were oblivious to the shifting tension in the forest. Only Connor, a quieter man growing up near the wilds, seemed unsettled. He occasionally glanced toward the darkness, but exhaustion dulled his instincts and dismissed his unease as paranoia. The grizzly moved in silence, her paws sinking softly into the mossy ground as she edged closer to the promise of food, her mind fixated on sating her hunger. Just past midnight, the camp had settled into a lull. Men lay sprawled out in temporary tents or under the stars, resting before they would tackle the next day. It was then, in the silence, that the bear finally crossed into the clearing. Aaron, who had been resting on a log near the fire, froze as he saw the hulking shape of the bear emerging from the trees. His heart skipped, a primal terror surging through him as he tried to process what he saw. He could only watch as the massive creature, her fur bristling in the firelight, sniffed the ground and slowly ambled toward the heap of discarded food. The rustling woke others. Men scrambled to their feet, shouting warnings and grabbing anything they could find. Tools, sticks, even rocks. Panic quickly spread. Some ran to nearby trees, trying to distance themselves from the bear. Others stood frozen, their instincts fighting a desperate battle against reason. Connor, who had reacted quickly, found himself behind a thick tree trunk, his pulse thundering in his ears as he kept his gaze locked on the bear. His breath came in shallow gasps as he searched for his crewmates. Most had managed to find cover, but then his eyes landed on Jonas, a friend and longtime co-worker standing dangerously close to the food pile. Jonas's reaction had been delayed. Fatigue and shock had slowed him, and now he struggled to decide which direction to go. Frozen in indecision, he turned back and forth, his mind paralyzed by the sight of the bear. It took only a moment for the bear to notice Jonas, and in that instant, the quiet tension of the camp exploded into violence. The grizzly-charged, powerful muscles rippled beneath her thick fur as she closed the distance between herself and her prey. Jonas finally tried to move, his legs carrying him in a frantic, uncoordinated sprint, but he stumbled, the loose soil shifting underfoot. Panic turned his legs weak, and the bear was upon him before he could right himself. The crew watched in horror as the bear, driven by hunger, struck Jonas down with a mighty swipe. His body crumpled under the force. Some men yelled and threw rocks, desperate to distract the bear, but their efforts only agitated her. She loomed over Jonas, who lay sprawled and bleeding, his breath shallow, as he tried feebly to shield himself. Aaron, gripping a heavy branch, took a step forward, torn between survival and the urge to help his friend, but none of them could intervene. Paralyzed by fear, they watched as the bear briefly turned her gaze on them, then returned to Jonas. In moments, the fight was over. As the bear withdrew, Jonas lay lifeless in the clearing, vanishing into the shadows. Silence fell over the camp, absolute and heavy. It felt like an eternity before anyone moved. Aaron finally approached the fallen man, and the others gathered around, staring at Jonas's still form in the firelight, his expression frozen in fear and pain. Grief settled over the camp, a dense weight that held them all. The men spent the night huddled around the fire, unable to sleep, haunted by the attack. Every sound from the forest jolted them, keeping them on edge, their minds replaying the horror. At dawn, the total weight of their isolation and injuries hit. Several men had scratches and bruises from their panicked retreat. Aaron nursed a gash on his arm while Connor limped on a twisted ankle. Once calm and familiar, the forest now felt hostile, watching them. The story spread in the following days, drawing scrutiny to their logging company. Protocols were questioned, and officials demanded answers for the lack of safety measures. The tragedy led to new guidelines on food storage and shorter shifts to combat fatigue. Each man returned with the memory of that night, the bear's growls, Jonas's final gaze, and the brutal reminder of nature's power. For some, the forest had changed from a workplace to a realm of terror. As they healed, they understood they would never take their surroundings lightly again. The wilderness, they realized, was not to be conquered but respected, and they would carry that lesson forward. David Thompson was not the type of man to scare easily. He was a retired park ranger and an outdoorsman with decades of experience. Pine Ridge was his sanctuary, a quiet suburban neighborhood against the sprawling Pinecrest National Forest. David's backyard opened to towering pine trees and winding trails. He knew better than the streets of his neighborhood. He lived alone with his two shepherd dogs, Max and Riley, on a quiet cul-de-sac. For years, he had relished the harmony of the place, the rare connection between suburbia and wilderness. But over the past months, a disturbance had stirred in Pine Ridge. A large black bear had started to frequent the neighborhood, lured by the sense of unattended garbage, pet food, and bird feeders. At first, the bear had been a curiosity, a reminder of the wild that lay just beyond the line of backyard fences. Some neighbors took pictures, others marveled at the paw prints left on muddy sidewalks, and David himself had even felt a twinge of respect for the animal's resilience. But curiosity soon turned to caution as sightings grew more frequent and closer. Garbage cans were toppled, bird feeders stripped clean, and flower beds trampled. Now a regular visitor, the bear showed little fear of humans or their homes. For David, the breaking point came one afternoon when he found the animal's deep claw marks on his fence posts, mere feet from his kennels. His dogs had been barking furiously, their nervous energy prickling the air. He knew that if the bear ventured closer, a clash between it and his dogs was inevitable and likely fatal. David made his rounds to the neighbors, warning them to secure their trash and keep their pets indoors, but not everyone took him seriously. Some shrugged it off, still charmed by the local wildlife, while others were too complacent to make fundamental changes. Frustrated, David decided he would take matters into his own hands. He began by setting up a series of traps near the edge of his property, simple snares, large cages baited with food, and even motion-activated lights to scare the animal away if it approached too closely. David was cautious not to harm the bear. He respected the creature, even if he feared it. But he was determined to keep it away from his and his neighbors' homes. To him, there was a line that the bear had crossed, and it was his responsibility to draw it back. His actions, however, did not go unnoticed. The wildlife authorities soon caught wind of his traps, and a heated disagreement ensued. The officers argued that the bear was not aggressive, but merely hungry, and that relocating it would only disrupt the ecological balance. They insisted on deterrence like noise-making devices or wildlife fencing, but David found their measures laughably weak. He knew the tenacity of a bear drawn to easy food. Without firm barriers, it would always come back. Tensions in Pine Ridge began to mount. Neighbors whispered about the bear man on the forest's edge in hushed voices. Some supported David, thankful for his protection, while others saw him as reckless, infringing on the natural order. But David was resolute. He believed that, without intervention, the bear would only become bolder. He had seen how animals adapted to human spaces, drawn into suburban life by the promise of easy meals. The authorities called it coexistence. He saw it as negligence. As the autumn deepened, the air turned crisp, and the bear grew increasingly desperate to bulk up before hibernation. It came to Pine Ridge with a renewed purpose, seeking food wherever it could. One night, David heard a familiar rustling outside and discovered his traps empty, the motion sensors disabled. His pulse quickened as he scanned the darkness, feeling the prickling presence of something nearby. He knew it was the bear. Grabbing a flashlight, David ventured cautiously to the edge of his property, hoping to scare it off before it could get any closer. But as he moved, he realized with a sinking dread that the animal was no longer lurking at the edges. The bear was already in his yard, pawing through his overturned garbage cans with slow, deliberate motions. David's heart pounded as he observed the creature, its bulk framed against the dim glow of the porch light. With a sense of creeping inevitability, David understood that this was a confrontation he could no longer avoid. The bear lifted its head, its dark eyes catching the beam of his flashlight. Time seemed to hang between them, suspended in a fragile moment of mutual recognition. David knew that if he turned his back and retreated, the bear would take it as an invitation, a signal of weakness. He braced himself, raising the flashlight higher, hoping to appear larger, more intimidating. But the bear, emboldened by months of successful foraging, was unmoved. It took a step forward, its massive paws sinking into the soft earth, closing the distance between them with a slow, unsettling confidence. David felt the gravity of the animal's size, its sheer strength, and in that instant, he understood he was not dealing with the wildlife he'd once known and respected. This bear had learned human habits and absorbed their spaces into its territory. What happened next unfolded with a brutal swiftness. The bear lunged, its dark form surging forward, and David stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to retreat, to escape. But his years of training failed him as the animal bore down, overpowering him with a force that left no room for survival. The neighborhood awoke to the sounds of violence that reverberated through the night, punctuated by the frantic barking of David's dogs. When neighbors arrived, the bear had disappeared into the forest, leaving only the silent aftermath of David's final stand. The shock that swept through Pine Ridge was profound. David's death cast a long, indelible shadow over the community, reshaping how neighbors thought of the wild bordering their homes. Some mourned him as a hero, a man who had tried to protect his own when the authorities had failed. Others argued that his actions had been reckless, driven by pride, and his disregard for the bear's life, ultimately leading to his death. Wildlife officials arrived in droves, determined to track and relocate the bear. Some residents supported capturing it, demanding safety measures to prevent another tragedy. Others, however, viewed the bear's presence as a reminder of the precarious balance between their homes and the forest. They argued for coexistence and better practices that respected animals while safeguarding human lives. Pine Ridge became divided, not by hatred but by fear and differing perspectives on responsibility. The bear was never seen again in Pine Ridge, but its memory lingered, as did the debates over how best to coexist with the wild.